we've actually managed to like work our way out of this. And now you've introduced this like new occult thing, like the oscillation of the market, which none of you even claim to fully understand. And now we're subject to its whims. And instead of Zeus, it's this fucking thing called the market. You know what I mean?
What's Left of Philosophy. I'm Lillian, and here with me today, as usual, is Gil, Owen, and Will. Hey, guys.
Hey. Hello.
So today is about Karl Kautsky, Karl the Renegade Kautsky, as it were. We took a look at a text called The Class Struggle that I think was originally written in 1899, but was reprinted in English I think a little later, and I think the volume that we read was from 1910 and had several editions. And it's basically a summation of some of the guiding principles and kind of theoretical background to the Erfurt program, which was the kind of founding program of the Social Democratic Party in Germany in 1891. He was the co-author of it with August Bebel and Edward Bernstein. So if you don't know about Karl Kautsky, he is pretty important and kind of a pivotal figure in the Marxist tradition. He was kind of widely understood, I think, during his generational period to sort of be the inheritor of Marx and Engels. I think Engels commissioned Marxist theories of surplus value into translation with Kautsky. So there's a lot of history there, a link between the kind of first and second generation of the internationals. Kautsky is kind of the standard figure for the second international. But he also did a lot of theoretical work. First, sort of like an outline of a Marxist theory of imperialism that has recently been revived and kind of reevaluated as time has passed. There is a pivotal role that he played in the argument, the famous reform or revolution argument between Bernstein and Rosa Luxemburg. And he argued against the reformists in that debate for a sort of class struggle parliamentarism as opposed to the kind of ethical evolutionary gradualism of Edward Bernstein. And then I think a lot of the positions that he develops, which I'll say a little bit more about, are kind of standard Marxian political positions on immigration, on women, on imperialism, and so on. I think he's became a controversial figure because of his political activity during the First World War and then afterward during the German Revolution. So in the first vote on the war, I think he abstained from voting for war credits, so this was widely criticized because he didn't vote against it. For what it's worth, Karl Liebknecht, who's widely known as being the only person to vote against the war, also voted for war credits in the first vote. So there's some kind of complicated history there. He broke with the SPD in 1916 or 17, joined the USPD, which is the Independent Social Democratic Party. But he didn't join the Communist Party of Germany. So there is this kind of implied break between Kautsky and the revolutionary tradition, and people sort of debate about that quite a bit. He served briefly in the revolutionary government of 1918, which was a joint government between the USPD and the SPD. And then in his later writing, and I think this is where he really kind of theoretically became known as more of a parliamentarist or a reformist than a revolutionary, however fair that may be, or not fair. He's well known for writing Social Democracy versus Communism and a series of anti-Bolshevik polemics. So in the text that we read, however, we focused on the Commonwealth of the Future, which is a central chapter of the class struggle. And I would say that there's a couple interesting things about this text. One obvious line of thought that goes through it is a kind of productive, what is often called productive forces Marxism. So there is a kind of an argument that the forces of production evolve, and then the relations of production become ill-suited to them, and then the relations of production are forced to reorganize themselves. And people often call this like a technological determinist or mechanical. I think when people say mechanical, that might be what they mean. Idea of history and social development. But then, there's also what I call like the B-side Kautsky, which is the Kautsky that isn't mechanistic or deterministic at all. And if there is the side of him that thinks like the productive forces are evolving and this kind of social change towards socialism is inevitable, he says things that are explicitly to the contrary very often. So like revolution is not inevitable. Or there's this phrase where he says the course of events is by no means independent of the individual. And there's like this real emphasis on human agency and education and knowledge. And so I think what's interesting about him is that you can kind of see why he would become a target for like kind of anti-communist or anti-Marxist or anti-whatever polemics in the academy. But it also kind of depends, the narrative that Kautsky is like just this mechanical thinker in the Second International is just so, kind of depends on people not doing their own homework and not reading Kautsky himself, because there is truth to the claims about the mechanism of the account of history. It's actually just not just that. And some of the very clearly first articulated arguments about the way socialists should relate to like a modern capitalist state, not an authoritarian state, not a state where you have to like be undercover, but a state in which you have to contest for parliamentary power. What's kind of odd about much of the discussion about Kautsky is it's like economic determinism and mechanism and all this. And then like apparently Gramsci is like when we started talking about politics. And I think when you read Kautsky, you realize that's plainly not true, that I would say that there's like an initial formulation of what would later become known of like as like non-reformist reforms, like the point of parliamentary politics, a really emphatic insistence on political rights and democracy as being instrumental for the proletariat. And I also think that there's a number of things like that come up that are not so emphasized in a lot of the discussion about Kautsky, is that some of the arguments about expropriation and about women, to me, seem like surprisingly modern. So he addresses the issue of like, what are we going to do with property? Like, what kind of expropriation of private property are we talking about? And then he tries to deal with like, I'm not going to take your car and your house and your TV. We're going to take the means of production and we're going to socialize them. And so there's a kind of fine tuning of like what people can expect from socialism. He talks about like the accusations that socialists want to abolish the family. And he says something that I think is just very contemporary, which is like yes and no. Like, yes, we want to abolish like the form of family that is like running working class people in the ground and making working class women like work more and not less, and, increases wage competition and so on and so forth. But no, in the sense that we want some kind of higher form of family, whatever that means. And then the last thing I'll say is that there is this real interest in democracy that people, I don't know if he gets quite a lot of credit for that, which is that, he argues that like systems of distribution change depending on a population's historical needs and their background institutions, like the kind of historical antecedents that exist in that place. And so there's this surprising awareness almost of the need for people to determine their own fate. And the argument at the end of the day is about freedom and not equality. And I think that this is something recent commentators have picked up on, that equality is good insofar as it is measured by living in a free society. And he has the really interesting formula that it's not freedom of labor that he's looking for, it's freedom from labor. And so another really contemporary argument is this kind of recent interest in like a kind of post-work ethos, or even connecting to our most recent episode that touched on this kind of issue with James Boggs, is that there's an existing desire to use the forces of production in a way that are going to enhance human freedom. So I'm just going to end my introduction with maybe just one of the two kind of brief paragraphs, which I think are kind of beautiful at the end of the section, where he says, "Science and art remain to the proletariat a promised land which it looks at from a distance, which it struggles to possess, but which it cannot enter. Only the triumph of socialism can render accessible to the proletariat all the sources of culture. Only the triumph of socialism can make possible the reduction of the hours of work to such a point that the working man can enjoy leisure enough to acquire adequate knowledge. The capitalist system of production wakens the proletarian's desire for knowledge. The socialist system alone can satisfy it. It is not the freedom of labor, but the freedom from labor, which in a socialist society the use of machinery makes increasingly possible, that will bring to mankind freedom of life, freedom for artistic and intellectual activity, freedom for the noblest enjoyment. And so I think you get this kind of idea.
Let's go.
Yeah, all the snaps, all the
this
snaps.
kind of rich cultural and scientific world that he sees in the future. And he has some of the same sorts of like anti-blueprint rhetoric that are very common in the Marxist tradition. But you can also see that like he wants to enhance people's lives. Like this idea that like socialism is this kind of like gray world where like everyone has to have the same values and is treated in the same way and is sort of drab and bureaucratic. You can kind of see that in this period of time in the Second International, what was envisioned was a flourishing of art, knowledge, and culture, and I think real like value pluralism that socialism makes possible for the first time. And I think that's worth thinking about. And maybe I've given this presentation in a kind of defensive mode, because I think like among academics and among people on the left, Kautsky is sort of disliked. But I think there's a B side, like I said, that we should talk about. So I'm wondering what you all think.
Yeah, I found it excellent. I thought it was really, first of all, extraordinarily clear and sort of clear-sighted. There's a real kind of, I want to call it like I suppose a realism or pragmaticism that I think guides a lot of the ways that he talks about, like you mentioned, for instance, there's a reckoning with what socialist practice would have to look like under conditions where one of, if not the most powerful economic social institution is the state, and the state in its modern form with, liberal parliamentarism as something that progressively takes on more and more economic functions, but only in a circumscribed way. That is, in order to secure the conditions of capitalist production. So he talks a little bit about the so-called Manchester School, which was fun because you could just swap out Chicago School for it today. I think we'd say this sort of free market, like laissez-faire, get the state out of the way of the market. And he's already in 1899 or what have you, like, no, that's silly. We know that the state's going to be like impressed into the service of taking on the functions of social organization that can't reliably be left to the market, right? Capitalism left to its own devices is a socially disintegrating force. And so things that can't be rendered like productive as enterprises, the state's going to need to regulate and manage these things. And in fact, I think we've seen what the disastrous results are of privatizing things like education or transportation infrastructure here in the 21st century. But this also looks very different than what does socialist practice look like in Russia, like in the early 20th century? Yeah, it might be insurrectionary, but that's like an autocratic and agrarian society with a different state form. And he thinks for very pragmatic reasons, trying to do an insurrection when people, working people, are committed to some ideas of parliamentary liberal democracy is like a non-starter, but also that's just like not practically an effective way of going about things. So for this reason, he advocates for, the formation of a socialist party that seeks to seize state power through official channels. There's a kind of, I guess we'd call it electoralism, I suppose, but like one that's geared toward revolutionary ends. And I think this is an interesting perspective that doesn't get a lot of play these days. I think most leftists are just automatically skeptical or suspicious of anything that looks like electoral politics. But I don't know. I think he might be onto something. What do you
I'm
think?
glad that we're starting there because I read, I forget where it was, but Lillian, it was one of the pages you suggested us as, kind of extra reading. And I highlighted it because one of the, at least he says, one of the sort of instrumental, rather than maybe intrinsic goods, one of the instrumental goods of parliamentarianism for Kautsky is that the development of a working party that succeeds in winning elections and shaping policy is not only good that it shapes policy, but it it gives working people the taste of hope and success. And sometimes, I feel like in contemporary conversations, I get, the beef with the Democratic Party, because one might see that actually the Democratic Party, what it's geared towards is producing despair and disappointment. But, what I think Kautsky gets really right about politics is, one cannot forge through in a mode of despair, nihilism, and resignation for long. That's actually really important for talking about real, actually existing everyday people, to be able to fall in love with success, to be able to see the fruits of whatever it is that you are doing. Now, when you're working in theory, it's very easy to be like, oh, you don't know, like in the long term, what you're going to do. But politics here and now, I think he thinks, the purpose of a political party is so that people can start to see practically, I do have agency in this world when I cooperate with other people. And so what I found was actually also what you were saying, Gil, is that sometimes I think it is forgotten that also the form politics takes will always have to be responsive to the relevant forces that shape the moment that we are in. So like when you were talking, I all of a sudden found myself being like, I don't know how helpful it is to look at a completely different historical situation and say, why can't we do that? So more like maybe modern examples, sometimes people will look at like, anti-colonial struggles in the 60s and be like, why can't we just do guerrilla warfare? And I'm like, well, I think there's some relevant differences, fighting in Algeria than fighting in Detroit. I know it might be sexy to say they're the exact same, but I don't think that they are. And so it's like Kautsky's registering that and saying, so what is actually the socialist practice of politics that allows people to experience that hope and taste of success? And that seems to me rather reasonable.
Yeah, I think that actually helps make sense of the kind of the mechanical determinism thing that you were mentioning in the beginning, Lillian. There's a tension between, or what seems sometimes like a tension between, a certain notion of like economic determinism at work in Kautsky, and then an insistence on like the unpredictability of the future, the fact that it's not all guaranteed to turn out in a kind of revolutionary direction, right? He says at one point, like, all these terrible things I'm describing about the current system don't necessarily need to like lead to revolutionary improvement. It's perfectly possible that we just descend into barbarism, right? And so like it's nothing's guaranteed. But I think like what's helpful about what you're saying there, Will, it seems to me that he wants to lay out a notion of historical transformation that is like moored in, like has moorings in, very strong moorings in social transformations and in, the advancement of like economic transformations, without tying it in a kind of deterministic way to those transformations and those processes. Now, I don't know, like I was going back and forth with how successfully he carries that out. But I think the place where you see that the most clearly is when he's trying to distinguish the utopian socialists from the kind of socialism that he is advocating for, and along with others at the time. He says the issue with the utopian socialists is that they had no choice but to like try to sketch out blueprints and to try to make, he uses the word like these almost like you want to salivate at this like picture they're portraying of like this future perfect society, because they were not moored in a historical process in which it looked like those things could, it was tangible to people that those things might, like big changes were on the horizon. Whereas at the end of the 19th century, everybody knows that like we are undergoing like massive transformations, and you don't have to rely, because you are moored in history at that historical moment. You don't have to like do the kind of totally imaginary blueprint creation of this is what the future society is going to look like. So I don't know, maybe that's a little bit unclear, but I think that's the tension between trying to stay moored in history without being determined by it.
Yeah. I think I can like add to that a little bit. There's like two things I wanted to say about that. One is that like the sense in which there's something unavoidable historically that he's describing, I think is misunderstood if we take him to be articulating like a philosophy of history where like socialism or communism is inevitable. He clearly doesn't think that. He does think, though, that like what's inevitable is the alternative socialism or barbarism, I think is how I'd put it, right? That like the internal contradictions of capitalist production in the course of its historical development are such that it's unsustainable in the long term. And that like either, like he says repeatedly things like, look, the choice that's open to the working class when faced with the sort of the sort of intrinsic contradictions. I know you keep asking us what contradictions are, Lillian, and I still don't know, but I could, I think just kind of in a general sense is either to like go down with the ship, or to try to institute a socialist mode of production, which would involve the abolition of private property of the means of production. And like, I feel like that's right. I feel like that. I think that those are the options. I think to this day, I feel like that's true. This isn't a teleological picture, but it's one that I think takes historical tendencies seriously. And sure enough, looking around 2022, it does not feel to me like capitalism is long-term sustainable.
I just want to say just quickly credit to his sense of historical tendencies. There's one point where he's talking about like Europe's, desire for territorial expansion and European nations.
Oh my God, this was amazing.
This can only go one of two places. He says it can either go towards a massive cataclysmic war between the European nations, one which like destroys existing nations and creates new ones. Oh, that's interesting. Or it ends up in a federation of all European countries together. And I think, damn.
I mean, he was right 3 times on that score.
And you know what? That's three times more than the average person. So I'm willing to give him that. I am wrong more times a day than he was right.
He's got some historical sense.
I get that. And so the other thing I wanted to say, because I am always struggling with this inevitability question. I was just in a reading group when we were talking about it. And so I think there's a difference between saying, and this is kind of building off what Gil was saying, that what's inevitable is this, positive outcome. So the positive outcome would be something like socialism. Instead, he's making a negative argument. What's inevitable is that capitalism cannot survive forever. But that doesn't actually necessarily say what will obviously happen afterwards or what will take its place. Instead, the argument is something along the lines of, and sometimes like his language is really strange here, what are we going to do with the knowledge that we have of the way the economic process is going? So he's very clear. Socialism builds on an already ongoing economic process. It doesn't substitute. It doesn't invent out of thin air a new economic process. And so, you either go in that direction, or this economic process is going to dissolve capitalism as a social form, and you might not like what life looks like when there is no social form to replace it. And I think that actually, that brings down the threshold of what the argument is. Because, I mean, honestly, it's fair. If someone were to ask, you're saying it's inevitable there will be communism, so we don't need to worry about the whole education part. And then someone could say, oh, no, the workers will naturally be educated. Like, so we don't need to actually try for it. No, something productive forces. And you can see how to many people that just seems like really implausible. But if you're making the argument that given what we understand these dynamics, that they will buckle under their own pressure, that is a very different type of argument that doesn't necessarily say politics has no place. In fact, it says politics needs to have a place given what these economic forces are tending to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really smart set of things you all just said. I hadn't really thought of it that way, that inevitable is that is that kind of choice that continues to present itself. And I wonder if in the context that he's writing, like this is simultaneously like theoretical and sort of explanatory. Like the text we read is the 8th edition, I think, and it was published by, and I think if people know this text, like there's a little brown version that we read, and it's the size of a pocket, like it's meant to fit in a worker's pocket. That's why it's the size it is. So like, I'll show it to you guys. Like,
that's cute. Yeah.
It's a tiny, cute little thing.
Yeah, and so
very aesthetic.
It's published by this kind of publisher in Chicago, and then you can see that there's a stamp on it. It says Labor Action Book Service, 114 West 14th Street, New York. So like, I think there's an audience for this, and I wonder if some of the more socialism is the inevitable outcome language is rhetorical in a significant way, where like, if what's needed is for people to have a sense of their own agency, then you want to make them have a sense of their own agency, that like they're so those kind of obvious contradictions in the text where it's like, if the productive forces do things, why do we need to do anything? Like the more obvious response is like, maybe he just never even thought that. Like maybe he knows that's a contradiction, and that's kind of besides the rhetorical point, because he's not a dummy, you know, like there's a
imagine.
I mean, you know, like maybe there's like a kind of different argument, but I do think that that's right, though, that like we continue to be faced with these alternatives. And I think that another interesting like line of thought is like what inevitability entails for like global economic development, because something that the Second International is often criticized for, and maybe Marxists generally, is like kind of accepting economic capitalist development on a global stage. So Marxists are often interpreted as sort of like aligning themselves with a liberal modernization thesis, you know, that like there's moral ambivalence about the development of capitalism, and in some sense this is kind of imperialist. I think it's much, I think that on the one hand, this is not a fair criticism because I think that the ambivalence applies within Europe itself. I don't think it's like a civilizational discourse where like these backward people need to become capitalist. I think there's this acknowledgement of the brutality of capitalist development in the global north, in that like a recognition that process is somehow inevitable, and that there is no turning back the clock. So in some ways, like the moral question of what to do with capitalism in places that are not yet capitalist, I think for Kautsky, that's like a moot question. It's like, they're just gonna be. Like, that's what's happening. And I think that is a complicated thing to say, because when people resist that, as they did in Europe, as they have all over the world, is resisting the transition itself at kind of odds with the socialist vision. But on the other hand, it's 2022, and there just isn't anywhere in the globe that isn't capitalist. Like, the places that aren't are very insignificant to like the global economy, politics, little kind of reservoirs of sociality that, and so I always wonder, like, what is the point of asking this, like, kind of making that challenge, because it is true that it was inevitable in a sense, like those like once England developed those kind of price pressures and started like having exports, like Germany and France couldn't continue to not be capitalist, and that happened. They didn't have a chance. They didn't have a chance, and it happened the world over, you know. And so I wonder about those moral questions inside that claim, because it also does kind of just strike me as true that it was inevitable in a way.
Yeah, I mean, so like when you're saying that, I mean, I don't know why I'm seeing this for the first time. So something like, you know, the sort of the critique of utopianism as moralistic is, you know, a critique rooted in the idea that, you know, if you're a utopian who thinks something like the point of politics is to make it so that capitalism, you know, doesn't win, whatever that means, doesn't become global, then you're very much not rooted in social reality, because where we are standing now, actually, those economic, you know, pressures and processes, they have won out. That's not quite up for moral debate. It's only up for moral debate insofar as I guess you could adjudicate whether it does bad or good things, but that says nothing about the direction it will go. Obviously, you know, newsflash, that's not my version of utopianism, but I see that is the critique. And so, you know, when you're like, you know, saying, Lillian, that, you know, there actually aren't major places that are quote unquote anti-capitalist or non-capitalist that are affecting the global economy, it seems as if, you know, politics has to face that reality. And so it's not simply about being abstractly against capitalism, whatever that might mean. It is, you know, given what we understand of these pressures and these forces, how can we, you know, shift what track these forces are going to go on? So there is no leaping back and saying, actually, can we actually have not done the capitalism thing? Let's just let's start with the socialist mode of production rather than going through all this nightmare business. But, you know, that's just it's not realistic. It's not political. But, you know, I don't know, for some reason when you said it, you know, I don't want this to sound dire. In a way, capitalism did win. We aren't at that like hinge moment where it's just like, I wonder if capitalism is actually going to go big or not. No, honey, he's gone big. He blew up. And so what do we do with that?
Yeah, this is great. There's a couple of points I'd like to make here. So like he says, you know, like you said, he's got his critique of the earlier utopian socialists. And there's a really interesting thing that he says at some point, right? In his critique of, I want to call it like planism or maybe programmaticism or whatever. One of the charges against socialists is always like, yeah, but you're not like, you haven't worked out the plan yet. You haven't told us exactly what socialism is going to look like. And he's like, you don't need to do that. It's a mistake to try to do that, right? Like this is an error because you're not going to be able to predict the shape of future things. But what you can do as an intellectual or someone who's trying to be like a student of history or a student of political economy is try to discern tendencies, And he says that, I think this is a good historical materialist claim that for whatever, tens of thousands of years, maybe, the processes of social development moved very slowly, maybe imperceptibly, if at all. For how long was human beings living in these pre-modern forms of social organization? And then starting really, I don't know, in the 1500s, it speeds up pretty quickly and pretty rapidly. We start seeing, intense evolutions of social forms and development of capitalism. Then we get the bourgeois revolution, so that it is possible then for maybe the first time historically to try to become aware of these laws of social development or evolution. The first attempts at which are the classical political economists. And then maybe they've got some baggage, right? They're still thinking about human nature in some ways that we're going to jettison, good materialists that we are. And with Marx, we'll develop an even deeper kind of analysis. But understanding the tendencies that are imminent in the present moment by looking at the historical conditions in the process of development gives us a clue for what needs to happen in order for the relapse to barbarism to be inevitable, right? And in this regard, it seems to me, at least in this text, right? I don't know other Kautsky, so I'm just working off what's going on here. But for Kautsky in this text, he seems to more than anything else insist on the way that capitalism in its process of development tends to replace small-scale production with large-scale production. Right, that the most significant thing for him seems to be what Marx calls the concentration of capital, whereby smaller forms of organizing labor in cooperation are progressively replaced by bigger and bigger cooperative forms. I was thinking when I was reading this about how prescient it was. It anticipates a lot of the claims that people like Paul Baran and Sweezy are going to write 80 years, 70 years later in Monopoly Capital, in trying to develop a theory of what does it look like when you get this monopolistic stuff. And so he says look, for the longest time, social organization for satisfying social needs was the norm. Now with the bourgeois society, we've got individual needs and individual ownership and individually owned production. It's that's not the norm historically, but the call for socialism isn't let's return to ancient communism. Because we have to depart from the present. And departing from the present means looking at this tendency towards large-scale production. So for him, socialism and socialist production is what happens when we have an institution of collective ownership of means of production, now on the basis of large-scale organization. Now no longer on the basis of these small kind of little pockets of production, which changes the game quite considerably, I think. And again, this is what I think is going on in the like I said, a very realist, historical materialist analysis of tendencies. He thinks, to put it in the terms that you two were just using in the conversation, you two were just having, you can't turn back the clock of the large-scale organization of production. And that changes what we have to understand by the possibilities of socialism.
Yeah, I was just going to say, listening to you, sometimes, I hear people, and I think that sometimes people forget that there are so-called conservative, but, maybe I don't want to use this pejorative, but reactionary critiques of capitalism, that, are premised on the idea of, why can't we get back to a time when social relations were more translucent, smaller, where the community didn't seem like it was so buffeted by social forces. And I think that's important to say, because sometimes I think if you don't realize that, you might think any critique of capitalism is obviously, a sort of progressive critique that is about expanding what Lillian has called, value pluralism. And so what you're saying there, Gil, is that, part of being realistic is understanding that there's no turning back the clock. And on the other hand, it also means saying something like, I guess, again, you all are saying things I guess I've never thought about this way, but has there ever been a moment in human history where the macro economic relations that really shape human life have been so available for human knowledge to pick through. So all at once, I always joke, like, capitalism is so goddamn complex. Like, I can't tell you what's going on in the market. And yet, when I think back to before we had all of this knowledge, I imagine most people, shit just happened. And you just had to, like, come up with wild metaphysics, no shade, Gil, wild metaphysics for why that was. And so that makes me think, should our political thinking, political philosophy also be different, given that we are in a different place where it comes to having the capacity to understand such large, complex macro forces as compared to, say, Plato? Would Plato be able to write the Republic now? And I don't mean that just as a silly question, but it seems to me this is a real philosophical and political difference that, Kautsky is saying the economic forces are now laid bare for us in a manner in which they were not in a pre-capitalist era. Am I getting that right? Does that make sense?
That makes sense to me.
Yeah, and like I think there's something really important in what you're saying, because if you take that as like a starting point, that like we can actually know ourselves and our world much better than we ever could before. And you don't need like some strong idea of reason and self-transparency to say that. It's just like we're able to study ourselves, like our behavior, even if I don't know my unconscious, I can see macro dynamic trends. We can model it statistically. We can do all kinds of things that like just were not done before, capitalism emerges across the world. Like, and there are places we have better and worse data about, like there's imbalances in like how we know, and blind spots that we have, and kind of filling in that we do that's very presumptuous and so on. But it's still just like qualitatively different, the kind of knowledge that we do in fact have about ourselves and like how we exist together. Like modern sociology begins with capitalism, like Durkheim and Weber and Marx, like that's what it's studying. And it emerges in Western Europe in that way because they had this thing to study, it's not because they were special. It was just like they were in a position to be like, holy shit, something is going on here. And I think that's important because there are two different tendencies that should put some, I think, cast into doubt. Like the idea that all critiques of capitalism are, I think, progressive in the way that Will is saying, because there's certainly a conservative one, like a capital C conservative one, which is like usually the same version that like resists like the French Revolution and shit, the kind of one that's like just opposed to modern liberalism and just like fully reactionary. Like
this whole rights thing was a mistake.
No, this exists. And then there's just like more less hard-hitting versions of that. A lot of conservative hostility to like globalism is like this, and sometimes is like capital C conservatism. But then I think there's also just like tendencies on like the nominal left, like whenever people try to just like resist modernity, or like the people who are like living righteously are always like across the world in some place I've never seen, and people I don't know because they're like external to the system. Like this kind of stuff is like very attractive to people who are like otherwise progressively minded, and they're like morals, So like
there's white folks in Costa Rica.
This like
looking
this,
for their noble savage.
The noble savage thing. And I think that the idea that like we have enough knowledge to know that we can't go back is kind of an interesting social position to be in, period.
Just building on what you guys are saying here, it's really interesting to me the way that his critique of like political parties that exist at his moment. I think it's obviously equally true of political parties, in the current conjuncture, is that they're not interested in like sufficiently epistemically and practically coming to grips with the current moment and with where things are heading in the future. He accuses like current political parties of having like a presentism, where they're incapable of seeing, and like they're not interested in coming to grips with like long-term tendencies, with like where we might be heading in the future, how to give that, even if you can't ultimately alter those historical and economic tendencies that are at work, to give them a certain impetus in a certain direction, to have some control over, to exercise some power over like the direction that we're heading. And so like, far from like, there's the critique of nostalgia, and then there's like the critique of the presentism that like technocratic managerial politics has, like even at the end of the 19th century, which it is also not interested in, again, like epistemically and practically coming to grips with all of these resources you guys just described, with like, what are the forces that we are subjected to, that we operate under? How could we exercise agency over those forces, and towards what ends? And that's just not like a something that any political, any of your kind of technocratic managerial political parties have any interest in whatsoever. Right? So it's not just the nostalgics; it's also the presentists.
I had the same reaction to that section. I thought it was so good. Like, there's a bit where he's like, people are always complaining that the Socialist Party doesn't like have a clear aim, and he's like, that's bananas. It's the only political party with a clear aim. He's the only one that actually has a goal. And like, he's like, by contrast, like, what's the aim? What are the aims, the long-term goals of like the Democrats or the Republicans here in the U.S.? Like, I don't know, just for like to manage the status quo for a little
it's
longer.
To like patch things up and keep it afloat.
Yeah, there's a quote where he writes, he's describing again, like the other political parties than the Socialist Party, and the context of his own writing again 120 years ago. But he goes, what do? They quote, they hold to the existing order, although they all see that it is untenable and unendurable. Their programs contain nothing except a few little patches by which they hope and promise to make the untenable tenable and the unendurable endurable. And I was just like, oh, that's the motto of the Democratic Party 1000%.
Life sucks. Maybe it won't later.
Maybe we'll work on it. By contrast, there's an aim. Socialism has a goal.
Also, the technocratic managerial party structure also has a way of making something called the economy or the market just this anonymous force that we all answer to. So I think there's also something different in saying economic forces have these tendencies than what I think is not great, mystifying them and saying, well, all politics can do is simply respond to the signals that this thing called the economy tells us that we need to do,
the
which
oscillations of the market.
It's just so funny that the Democratic Party often always sounds like middle management, like, hey, even I've got a boss. What can you do? And and so it's like Kautsky is saying, you know what?
Who's your boss?
If for no other, the Democrat Party, it's either the Supreme Court, the market, the economy, and honestly, for some of them, the Republicans. It's really wild that you think your political opposition is also your boss, but I'm not here to tell you to do your business. I've never been elected to office, so I guess I don't get it. And so it's like Kautsky saying,
we sure know they don't care
be
what you have to say about it either, so we're all good.
Exactly, middle management.
We're mutually disdainful of the other's
office
desires.
space, it'd be really great if you came in on Saturday. Oh, I have plans. It'd be really great if you came in on Saturday.
Yeah, I think it's funny how he says, like, because they're always reacting to like the forces of the market, and the way that like the bourgeois state governs is that you're beholden to like these fluctuations and oscillations in the market. He's like, listen, we got a chance to basically do away with at least some of the destruction wrought by the contingencies of nature, right? Like droughts and all these different, insufficient technology for good crop yields and all of this stuff, right? We've actually managed to like work our way out of this. And now you've introduced this like new occult thing, like the oscillation of the market, which none of you even claim to fully understand. And now we're subject to its whims. And instead of Zeus, it's this fucking thing called the market. You know what I mean? And he's like, what a waste of this advancement.
Yeah, what a waste.
That we just now have to be like slaves again to this. Like,
I guess sometimes there is going back for these political parties. Like, I'm dying. Instead of Zeus, it's the market.
That's really good. Yeah. Well, I mean, it just like, it's a really basic Marxian insight that like, the sort of way in which capitalism reorganizes social production in an increasingly scientific, productive way, the possible salutary effects that might have on like the working class are just annulled by the fact that the means of improving the productivity of labor, right, which we get in Capital One. You have the sort of economies of scale of increasingly large scale production, an increasing technical division of labor, and the implementation of machinery, right? These are all basically implemented everywhere, right? In all industrial sectors. But why? Because for capitalism, you have to fucking beat out your competition, and you're trying to increase the rate of surplus value. But like, what if production wasn't geared around surplus value? What, as he says, if instead we had production for utility, for like actually satisfying needs? And like, those same means of altering the production process could be used in an enlarged way to like make the needs of everyone just like a met thing, just like done at the same time that like the hours that you'd have to work could be effectively reduced almost to zero. Like I like that you brought up the Boggs, Lillian, because there's like an anticipation of the automation thesis here, right? He's like, look, capital's already replacing your work with machinery. Like lean in, but use the products of labor to solve problems instead of just like immiserating ever greater portions of the working class, right?
I love this. Lean in, but don't lean into more workplace. Lean into not having to go to work for most of your life.
Exactly. But insofar as, essentially access to the means of subsistence continues to be mediated through a wage that you get only by selling your labor, yeah, the implementation of all of these techniques of improving the production process just mean ever greater immiseration, right? And again, it's a really basic Marxian insight. The general formula for capital is MCM prime. And like that M prime means shit to me and most humans on the earth, right? It's nothing. It's nothing.
I'm really
for most of
happy
us.
whenever Elon Musk somehow gets a return on whatever it is that he does. I feel that.
Yeah, I love that.
He's like me, for real. And what you were saying also builds on, I actually also loved what Kautsky had to say about the family form, because also what you're saying there, Gil, is something that gets thrown at socialists or, I guess in the present day, so-called radicals or whatever. It's like, oh, so you mean that we should just become completely not human? The world that you're talking about is a world in which, we don't have fathers and mothers anymore.
No more
We're
fathers
all just
and mothers.
people.
Communal wives.
Yeah. And I can just kidnap other people's children because they're mine anyway.
I'm kidnapping children. They belong to me.
But when you look at present-day
Don't
society...
clip that out of context, reactionaries.
But they will. But what Kautsky is also saying is all those things that you're worried about the dissolution of the family form, that's already happening. What do you think it means where you have to increasingly spend time away from home, get increasingly worried about whether you can feed your children,
and divorce rates among working people are higher than they've ever been, and like women are not having babies or like getting married because there's no point or they can't. Like,
seems like capitalism's destroying the family.
I can promise you, socialism didn't do that. Like,
and and the ones that can afford it, like it's just all like childcare and night nurses. No time for them. Like,
the family.
I just
it rules.
The family.
It's a real family.
I just had a kid. I'd love like the luxury of doing like a couple years of just like family form shit for a bit, but it's not an option. Like capitalism has destroyed even the option of family. So
what are we holding on to this thing for again?
Right.
I get it. It's here, and I'm able to get iPads. That's awesome. But sometimes it's like it just feels be a little cycling. Like feels like there's a little projection going on. Where you're saying like, well, under capitalism, you're going to be bored, eviscerated, have fragile social relationships, and I just watched the same version of reality TV show on Netflix. I don't know where I'm going to live next year. I don't know. Did socialism do that to me?
I feel like it wasn't socialism. Well, he makes the same argument in response to the charge. He's like, all right, we got all these. There's also a really interesting discussion, which I don't know if we'll have time to get into, about like being against discussions about distribution. Where, again, very classical Marxian point, read the Critique of the Gotha program, where he's like, look, if you think that like socialism just means like leaving the mode of production intact and distributing better, you missed the point, right? Like Marx argues pretty clearly, and Kautsky like just picks this up and runs with it, that the mode of distribution is dependent on, conditioned by the mode of production, which has got a kind of primacy. So he's like, you could think about how we'll distribute wealth after like we establish a socialist mode of production, but like kind of why? They're like, we'll see what it looks like.
Why are you putting the cart before the horse?
Why are you putting the cart before the horse? But the other argument I wanted to bring up that he makes that's got like the same basic form or structure as what you were just saying about the family is like, sometimes you get critics of socialism who say something like the following. They go, sure, maybe if we organize society in a socialist way, that would be better for the majority of working people. We'd meet more of their needs, but at what cost? At the cost of economic freedom, right?
Yeah,
They would
yeah.
no longer, they'd be, and and the analogy he gives is great, right? Like maybe that bird in the cage is fed, but it's because it's in a cage. And is that what you want for the working class? Like that would suck. And he makes the same exact argument about this economic freedom that he did with the dissolution of the family. He's like, yeah, in large scale production, you already don't have economic freedom. And again, capitalism did that. Like at most you have the freedom to like choose which master you have, which great. Congratulations. You can quit your job and get a new boss. So what? It's freedom from economic labor. That's the point. And it's already, if you're really worried about losing economic freedom, like kind of bad news. Capital already saw to that. Right?
Like, have I got an economic system to describe to you?
Yeah.
I think that what's striking about the text is just how in a way, like we would just use different language and stuff, but like how contemporary this is. Like, what does the right say now? You want to take away our economic freedom. You want to abolish the family. You want to do all of this. Like, and and I think it's a really interesting rhetorical strategy that we rarely try these days, which is just like, no. These problems that are afflicting you are not my fault because socialism isn't here, and that's
in some hypothetical future.
I'm not in power. Why are you on me?
So like there's something about turning around like, oh, it's interesting that you're worried about that. Look at the decimation of working class families, like what women have to do to survive, involuntary forms of sex work or having to come home and just do more work after you do one kind of work and like
double shift.
Like just whatever, man. Like he has all these examples of like, I can't think of them now, of like the things that are terrible for working class women in this way and like in this society. And then he's like, yeah, but like socialism didn't do that to them. You did that to them.
Wait, who did that?
Sweetie, that wasn't socialism.
Honey, no.
And I don't feel like we really use that rhetorical strategy like super at all anymore. Like we're kind of like, no, we don't, or like, yes, we do. But like, obviously, the answer is things are really bad, and capitalism did that. So it doesn't matter whether or not we want to like what kind of families we want. Whatever we're gonna do is gonna be better than this because look at what is happening right now. And
look at this. This is terrible.
Yeah. And I do think that is like a much better response than like. Yes, absolutely. Lean into it. We want to abolish the family or like, and if that is like what you want, I'm not like criticizing that, but I mean, as an argumentative strategy, like just saying yes or no, it's not us. We're not the ones who want to do that. Like neither of these things are satisfactory because none of it points out like actually the problem here is that capitalism harms women and families and we want to stop doing that,
And that also just sounds way more principled than saying, in my ideal world, and I'm just like, I don't want to conjure it up again, but I'm also remembering restaurant discourse when that invaded Twitter. I'm just like,
restaurant discourse was lit.
What are we doing here except, again, trying to be managers and saying,
For listeners in the future who weren't on Twitter like a few months ago, who have no idea what we're talking about, there was a whole series of arguments that people were having about whether or not there would be restaurants in socialist society. And the whole of leftist Twitter just tore themselves to pieces trying to figure out the way to answer that question, which is like, I don't know, man. What are we doing?
Yeah, anybody who wants restaurants has never worked in the service industry. And,
Wait, it got really serious?
Yeah, this was a big
Get out.
big
I
thing.
mean, sometimes you live such a blessed life. You don't get to see what the online left does to itself. It's really incredible, and it's all public. It's all free.
It's all free.
I do. I have like configured my algorithm where like I get glimpses of it. Like I saw a friend tweet about restaurants, so like I did know it was happening, but I don't see enough of it to know like really what's happening.
Well, you're really missing out because it was cutting edge socialist discourse. Let me tell you, we had on the one hand like bourgeois defenders of private property who like restaurants, and then on the other hand like radical like decolonial like revolutionaries who wanted to eliminate all forms of restaurateur and entrepreneurial. It was awesome.
That started to tend towards, guess what? Under socialism, life sucks, but at least we're good people. I'm like, I don't know who you won with that, but cool.
I love just like the maximally alienating approach to politics. You know, like some people would come on and be like, "So wait, under socialism, is it cool if I cook for my friend?" Like,
And it's like, no,
is it
you
cool
can't
if I
do
cook
that.
my
That's
friend
an
a meal?
alienation of your labor.
And they're like, and I'm like, we're fucking doomed, you know?
Wait, did someone say no? You're not allowed?
Oh yeah, someone was like, well, it depends on the conditions of the labor and all. Like,
It's just like,
so sick.
Oh
That's
yeah,
so
no.
tight.
I actually had like a long dark night of the soul in that moment. Like, I don't think we're gonna make it.
Yeah, man. Well, I mean, like, again, like, this is why I love that this is a good moment for a little Kautskian wisdom, right? Like, stop planning for what like socialist food production is going to look like and look at the tendencies of the present. Can we please return to a little bit of realist analysis instead of imagining like, oh, in communism, like maybe food's going to look like this or that. It's like, you don't know what you're talking about. Let's relax.
That's to be figured out. Just like, I love that moment where he's like, and as far as confiscating people's property, I mean, that's like, don't worry about that. Like, that's to be figured out in the future. And some people are like, I'm pretty worried about that. Can you let me know whether that's
Wait, is that gonna happen?
Can you let me know whether that's going to be a thing? Like, I'm petit bourgeois, like, shop owner. Like, I'm just trying to figure out, am I getting expropriated under this new system?
Is he talking about me?
No, and once again, he's like, "Oh, are you a small business owner? Good luck holding on to your small production because capitalism."
But he makes the same point there, where he says it's not socialists that are ruining small production. That's already been getting ruined.
Happening, and it's capitalism, baby.
Yeah, his way out of the argument with like the small, that's true. I didn't realize that. His way out of the argument with the small business owner reactionaries is the same as the one with the family and all of this. It's just like, that's not our problem. Capitalism is doing that. Capitalism is doing that to you anyway, bucko.
Yeah, basically,
Amazon, right?
you've got bigger problems than what socialism's gonna do.
Yeah, our thing is we would like to like reorganize production so that you could survive, whereas your large franchise owning competitors want you to die in the poverty on the street. So
Yeah, Walmart
doesn't matter
really
what.
wants you to go under. That's its goal.
yeah, Walmart wants to take you
They
down.
would love it if you did.
Yeah.
So here's kind of an interesting paragraph that I found while you were talking about tendencies. So he's talking about whether or not you should care about like equality of incomes, which is another thing that he doesn't really think is that important. Like he thinks that something else is important, and I actually didn't quite understand this part. But he said, this change in the tendency of incomes is, in the eyes of socialists, of more importance than the absolute increase of incomes. So what he's talking about is like the tendency of incomes to diverge and differentiate and low wages to become depressed or whatever. This is more important than like what like capitalist apologetics usually say is like, we're going to raise the floor of the bottom. And even if you have so much wealth inequality up here, at least everyone is just less shit poor than they were relative to 500 years ago or something like this.
Right.
Rising tide lifts all boats.
Love it.
Yeah. So his
I've
point,
heard.
he's like, this is not really what's important. It's the tendency of the incomes that exist. And he's like, the thoughtful man lives more in the future than in the present. What the future threatens or promises preoccupies him more than the enjoyment of the present. Not what is, but what will be, not existing conditions, but tendencies determine the happiness both of individuals and of whole states. I feel like he has this like whole process eudaimonism going on where he's like, happiness is a process that like we are attaining virtue through like understanding the tendencies of our appetites and so on, and what we need to do is like get it all in order, or maybe that's Epicureanism, I don't know, something like that. I feel like there's kind of there's like a meta theory there of like the focus has to be on the process because what we need to do is like put it at the energies in the right channels, and it's not about the
Just after that, he's like, look, if you look at any little islands of communism in America or in France, wherever it existed, look at the equanimity, the tranquility. Like he starts using all these like almost kind of like virtue ethics, like kind of language. And it a lot of it, he says, derives from the fact that you are no longer subject to those uncertainties, right? To the whims of, well, I was saying like Zeus or whatever, but it's not to the whims of the oscillations of the market.
For freedom.
Yeah, I love that. And and I'll just say also what I kind of got from the equality of income part is also trying to debate that is already assuming that a certain problem that we're trying to solve now will still be existent in this new world. And so it's as if saying something along the lines of, but okay, how will we preserve or abolish, competition on the wage I have in order to reproduce myself? And what we don't know is, if it is true that we're able to transform the mode of production, will that still be a salient political question? I think a way of arguing against socialism is to assume that these questions are eternal and say that socialism can't answer these eternal questions. But it seems Kautsky's saying, I don't think that those are eternal, ahistorical political problems. So why are we getting caught up in it?
Yeah, that's just to naturalize capitalism as transhistorical, right? This is precisely not the point of materialist analysis.
All right, that does it for us today. New episodes of What's Left of Philosophy come out every 2 weeks wherever you get your podcasts. Also check us out on YouTube for videos and live streams. Before closing out today, we'd like to take a minute to thank some of the people who are supporting the show on Patreon. We couldn't do this without you, and we are really grateful. Today's new patrons are Hugh Adams, Blake557, Retcon, Galen Doucette, Brett Nichols, Grant Nebergal, Maddie H., Caroline, James McCoy, Nicholas Green, Ethan, last-name, Tommaso Caproti, Jeremy Greensmith, Philip Curl, TT392, Luke Mouleyson, Eli Pine, N. Michelle Lacroix, Brooke Stepp. Thank you all very much. If you too like what we're doing and want to support the show, please go to our website, leftofphilosophy.com, and click the support button. Patrons get access to exclusive content like locked episodes and bonus videos. You can also buy some What's Left of Philosophy merch from the store linked on our website. Follow us on Twitter at @LeftOfPhil, and don't forget to leave us good reviews and comments on your podcast app. With that, thanks for listening, and we will talk to you next time.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Take care, everyone.